Hello, my name is Shriveling Fire, and I'm going to be playing through Dark Souls 3 and commentating on it as I go. These will be edited, jumping around types of videos, and for this series I'm going to be focusing only on the gameplay of the Dark Souls games. I feel the lore has been talked about to death, and I also want to get into the design aspects of the game. This episode is going to be about the Cemetery of Ash and one little bit of Firelink Shrine, and we're going to get right into it by talking about the enemy designs and movesets. The first enemy that we're going to talk about are the Hallows and Crossbow Hallows. They're pretty low damage, easy to block, they don't take away that much stamina, they have really obviously telegraphed attacks, and have fairly low health. They're pretty standard, easy enemies. They make for a pretty easy introduction to multi-enemy combat once we have to fight a few of them on the cliffs. There is one thing that I want to talk about though, and that's their clothing. Something very clever that the designers have done here is the cloak around the Hallows. This immediately draws the eye towards the weapon hand of the Hallows, which is a nice touch, and I think it makes it subtly easier to read their movements. I'm going to be skipping over the dog and cover it in the High Wall of Lothric episode. For now, I'm just going to talk about the Crystal Lizard, because I think it's a pretty nice enemy to have here. It has slow attacks, it does a pretty decent amount of damage. You can see here that I'm actually going to fight it without rolling at all, which I really enjoy. I think the Crystal Lizard has a great moveset for beginning players to learn, because again, not needing to dodge emphasizes positioning in a really cool way, which I really enjoy. The one part of its moveset I don't really agree with is the tail flicking out after the roll. It's pretty unfair. I don't really see how I was supposed to know about this without getting hit by it. The Crystal Lizard also uses its visual design pretty well. You can see the crystals draw the eye towards the head, and most of, if not all, of the Crystal Lizard's attacks are primarily telegraphed through the head. It also helps that the grey, rocky flesh it sort of has blends into the bland background. It really draws the eye towards what's important, something that will become a little bit lost later in the game, but I'm getting ahead of myself. We've gotten through all the normal enemies at this point, normal being relative for the Crystal Lizard, but we're going to move on to the boss of this area, which is Udex Gandia. For Phase 1, all its attacks are pretty much blockable besides the shoulder smash you'll see occasionally, and the fact that you can actually parry him adds an extra tutorial aspect to it. It's a pretty solid basic moveset. The fact that you can get through this first phase fairly easily without dodging at all leads to a pretty major problem later in the boss fight. But before I talk about that, I also want to point out how he looks. His color palette is really dull, there's no other word for it. But the fact that his weapon sticks so far out to the side goes a long way towards making him much more readable. I can guarantee that if this guy had just some type of short sword, he would also be holding it far off to the side. But moving into Phase 2. This is to teach you how to dodge. It's a pretty immediate ramp up from the last phase. It's not all that hard, it telegraphs the entire county every time it attacks, but this is the first time you'll really expect it to dodge, since everything before this can be blocked, and putting it in the second phase of this fight feels a bit strange. He's not hard, but I'm willing to bet many a veteran player, myself included, got to the second phase of this fight without any problems, only to get immediately pounded into a pulp. The camera's also a huge issue if you get in close to Gandia, something you'll have to do unless you start as a mage or pyromancer. Most of the monster portion of the boss is off screen. Dark Souls 3 really doesn't have an excuse for this anymore. Picking some random examples, it was an issue with the old hero in Demon Souls, the Centipede Demon in Dark Souls 1, the Last Giant from Dark Souls 2, and Vigor Melia Bloodborne. The Souls series has essentially had 4 games to find a solution, but they still put in these horrible camera angles. Still, this isn't as bad as attacks which blatantly break the lock-on for no reason, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Gandia works. He's not difficult, but the second phase has frustrating camera angles and requires a technique the players never really needed before. It's not bad for veterans, but I can definitely see new players hitting their heads against this for a while. It also feels like a pretty major step up in difficulty compared to how easy the Asylum Demon was in Dark Souls 1, but maybe that's getting a little bit subjective. Now, since I'm not planning to do an episode on Firelink Shrine, there's something I want to bring up in this episode, the Swordmaster. This is a hell of a step up. The fight's location is not at all to your advantage. He has almost the exact same amount of health as Gandia. He takes away more stamina per hit if you're blocking his attacks compared to the majority of Gandia's attacks. He can parry, and he even hits harder than Gandia. Something else I want to show you is what I think was the concession made for the sake of PvP. As I roll past him, he suddenly whips around to hit me. From what I've heard, it's to make strong, heavy attacks more viable. It doesn't really bother me that players and NPCs can do this. It bothers me that later bosses and even basic enemies will start pulling this. That fight with the Crystal Lizard where I didn't have to dodge at all, that emphasized positioning in a way that was really satisfying. But the Swordmaster is just a case of learning his moveset and dodging at the right time. Something that can be really rewarding, don't get me wrong, but starts to feel a little cheap once you realize it almost doesn't even matter if you can get behind him. You can expect this behavior with a lot of the humanoid enemies in the game, so don't expect me to stop complaining about this too soon. Anyway, at this point I want to talk about the actual, level design of the level. The canyon is pretty dull. It leads the player well enough, but it's essentially just a path straight to the boss. It distracts the player a little with tiny offshoots, including the Crystal Lizard fight, but it's not much. The reason Dark Souls 1 levels were great was not because they were necessarily these sprawling open things. It was the way the levels looped back in on themselves to make really interesting and rewarding exploration. It's not really rewarding exploration to go down the tiny offshoot to grab a soul. To help illustrate this, I'm gonna draw some maps. I'm not an artist, so please excuse my horrible drawings, but let's just draw a functional map of the levels. Hey, it's Editing Will, just explaining something super fast. A dashed line connected to a node in the map represents a shortcut that you open up, and a solid line represents a path which you cannot get back onto once you cross into the node. Okay? Okay. This will all make more sense in just a second, trust me. I don't care about the twists and turns of the level, I care about the start, the end, and the path you take to get there. This straight line is really most of the cemetery map. There's one little knobby bit at the start to get a soul, one little knobby bit to fight the Crystal Lizard, and one little knobby bit to get the firebombs, plus this tiny alternate path to get Titanite Shard and the boss. It looks kind of interesting. It's, 3 offshoots to dead ends and one tiny alternate path. But then let's compare that to the Undead Asylum. So we start, we go to the bonfire, we go to the boss room immediately. Now we go on this path back around to the bonfire, then back around to the boss with this one little tiny path we can't even open up yet. Do you see what I mean? This is a gross oversimplification. It doesn't even map the enemies, but I think it explains why the level design is much more satisfying in Dark Souls 1. I'm gonna try to draw a map like this in every episode. Hopefully they'll get a bit more complex as we go. One area I'm really excited to talk about is the cathedral. But for some areas I'm looking at you, Road of Sacrifices, it'll look pretty depressingly similar. This has gone on a little long for such a tiny area. There were just some basic complaints I had to get out of the way, but next time we'll move on to the High Wall of Lothric, where I can complain a lot about the Lothric Knights. Thanks for watching.